Welcome dear participants to the last module of this week. So far we have discussed the interconnections between media and culture and how they are being shaped continually by each other. We have discussed already how the shifting worldviews about the interconnections between media and culture have given rise to various theoretical approach. In the middle of the 20th century, we find that the work of two major theoreticians, Harold Adams Innis and Marshall McLuhan, started to create waves. They started to talk about the relationships between communication technology, media, and also the way the institutions of our social, economic and political modules work. They also try to understand how the formalities of power which are exerted by these institutions to interact influence the media and are also influenced by the way the media functions. Harold Innis is one of the lesser known philosophers. However, we find that he has exerted major and significant influence on the contemporary understanding of media, and also he influenced particularly among others the work of Marshall McLuhan. Innis was a trained social scientist, so he has tried to merge the methodology of social sciences with his attempts to understand how the forces of media work. He has started to talk about social history of using media and how we can try to understand the development of different empires and civilizations through a history of media at a time when people were not aware of this approach. Marshall McLuhan has used methods of literary criticism. He has been influenced by the new critics, particularly by F.R. Lewis. His approach is sometimes termed as technological determinism, and he is one of the most cited theorists in the area of media criticism. Harold Innis was primarily a political theorist in Canada. He was interested in sociology, history and economy, and he became popular with the projection of his staples theory, in which he tried to show how Canadian economy is based on the export of staples, for example, raw materials, fish, for lumber, etc. He also tried to analyze the US policies of economy and defense and how they were working under the era of Cold War politics. He also tried to show how the media has influenced our understanding as well as our creation of the Cold War. He has used basic concepts of time and space to understand the rise and fall of different empires in human history. We can almost say that after the work of Edward Gibbon was published, in which he has tried to analyze the reasons of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, he is one of the major theoreticians who has attempted this task of the analysis of civilizations. Harold Innis has also tapped the civilizations which were covered by Gibbon, as well as he has taken up the social history in the intervening duration. In his famous book Bias of Communication, he has concentrated on trying to create a social history of the media or the communication media. He has talked about how the media influences our perceptions of time and space, and he also started what came to be very soon known as the Toronto School of Media Studies. As he was trained in the methodology of social sciences, we find that there is a consistency in his research methodology. His methodology as well as his arguments have anticipated what we today understand as historical archaeology, as well as the methods of documentation propounded later on by Michel Foucault. He had a historical approach, and his study of communication and media directly influenced McLuhan's approach in his famous book Understanding Media. He also suggested that the equilibrium and proportion of media in a culture determines how stable they are. Innis has tried to trace the implications of the media of communication to understand how the character of knowledge is formed in a particular civilization. In his presidential address to the Royal Society of Canada, which he had delivered in 1947, Innis analyzed the evolution of communication media from the cuneiform script inscribed on clay tablets in ancient Mesopotamia to the advent of radio in the early 20th century. And he says that he has tried to suggest that Western civilization has been profoundly influenced by the communication, and that marked changes in communications have had important implications for the way the Western culture and economic forces have developed. He also suggests that a monopoly or oligopoly, which is a limited competition of knowledge, is built up in the contemporary Western civilization to a point that equilibrium is disturbed, and therefore, in his works he has also talked about certain threats which are inbuilt in the contemporary Western media. He was the first media theorist to emphasize the role of media and communications in the process of empire formation and their maintenance since the beginning of the civilization. Unlike McLuhan, he says that media is not an extension of our sense organs or cognition, and he has tried to structure his theory on the perception of space and time and how these perceptions influence the empire building throughout our history. He has also talked about how all kinds of media exhibit a certain bias, features that help in the control of space and time and in the formation and continuation of different empires throughout human history. We can also say that the development of communication media in the work of Innis is the key to understand social changes. He has talked about certain issues, for example, how do particular communication technologies function in different societies, what norms do they take and how do they contribute to society, as well as what forms of authority and power do they encourage. According to Harold Innis, monopolies of knowledge eventually face challenges to their power, especially with the arrival of the new media. Forms of media contain a preconception or bias in terms of the structure and mechanism of information. The bias they encode in terms of their characteristics have been listed in three categories by Innis, that is the type of material, ease of access and the conditions of production. In the type of material, he talks about the durability or the non-durability of a medium, whether a medium of communication is light or heavy to transport, whether it can be transported at all or not. Secondly, he talks about the ease of access. For example, the scarcity in the production areas of papyrus ultimately led to the rise of those civilizations which could easily have access to it. He has also talked about the decentralization of the production of paper and how it has encouraged the civilizations towards a democratic approach. He has also talked about the production condition of media. For example, the stone carving was so time taking and transportation of it was nearly impossible. So, he talks about the timeliness, the quickness in which the clay tablets could easily replace the stone carving, water supplies for the production of parchment, paper and the technical know-how. He also suggests that stability in the use of a media involves balance between space biased and the time biased media. Media technologies and their functionings are intimately tied to the creation of monopolies of knowledge. Innis has said that in the early days of human civilization, power and knowledge were concentrated in the hands of the clergy. The role of the priests, the scholars, the monks and the scribes who used to work within monasteries which had spread throughout Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire, also dominated the production and spread of knowledge and thereby controlled power in contemporary Europe. So, the power was vested in a scribal and literate religious elite, and their authority and privilege was accepted by the illiterate masses for the interpretation of the text, and also they decided what could be known and what could not be known. So, the illiterate worshippers depended on priests for interpretation of the scriptures, and at the same time the only other thing they could interpret was the image driven media, for example paintings and statues that depicted the central figures in biblical stories. But this medium also had a certain limitation. Soon we find that this monopoly was challenged by the space binding medium of paper, which was initially imported from China. This import of paper from China also expedited challenges from Islamic kingdoms, and later also from a rising commercial class. As we have already seen in the previous modules, it resulted in the growth of trade and commerce. It also resulted in a growth of centers of education and universities, which challenged the control of monasteries and church over education. There was a simultaneous rise of vernacular language, challenging the cultural dominance of Latin language, and we find that the balance gradually shifted towards space over time. It also led to Protestant Reformation, European exploration, and the empire formation by the Western powers, and at the same time it gave impetus to the scientific investigation and a rational spirit of inquiry. To sum up, we can say, and then here I am quoting Innis, he says that the dominance of parchment in the West gave a bias towards ecclesiastical organization, which ultimately led to the introduction of paper, which had a bias towards political organization. So, we find that there was a particular cultural dominance of parchment, which resulted in a bias towards a particular type of organization. So, Innis wants to suggest that every medium of communication has a certain bias towards a particular type of organization. He again continues to say that with printing, paper facilitated an effective development of the vernaculars and gave expression to their vitality in the growth of nationalism. So, the adaptability of the alphabet to large scale machine industry also became the basis of literacy, advertising and trade, which in turn affected the commerce, the international establishment of European empire and various scientific investigations. So, we find that the book replaced the parchment, and in turn the spread of the newspaper strengthened the position of language, which also generated a bias towards nationalism. He has taken up a study of the United States, and he says that the dominance of the newspaper in the United States led to a large scale development of monopolies of communication in terms of space and implied a neglect of problem of time. As we have already commented, the research methods which Innis has used are based on his training in social sciences. His work is based on a study of history. He has tried to find clues and evidence, cross-checking information, data and facts continually. However, his understanding of historical evolution is centered on the technology which different civilizations used to communicate their ideas. Sometimes it is said that he has also taken up an approach of technological determinism, which is fundamental to the information society model. The development of communication, according to Innis, leads to change, and changes are dependent on the way communication technology takes shape and shapes the society. He has also been criticized. Critics often say that he is basically a reductionist, and he is unable to take account of different strategies and conflicts outside the immediate area covered by the communication technologies. He has also ignored and sidelined the difficulties faced by those people who were on the margins. He has not been able to take into account issues like poverty, social inequalities and exclusion of certain people from the mainstreams of the society. Innis has differentiated between the media as being time biased or space biased. He says that our society is usually concerned with duration over time and extension in terms of space. He suggested that the conditions for society to control the space where they live and their attempts to survive over time create certain media and in turn are also influenced by the media. And I quote from him, "It has seemed to me that the subject of communication offers possibilities in that it occupies a crucial position in the organization and administration of government and in turn of empires and of Western civilization." Unquote. To understand this point further, let us try to find out what are the differences between the media which is time biased and the media which is space biased. A time biased media primarily has an oral culture. He has taken examples of the mediums of stone, clay or vellum which were time taking. Writing any message on them, is inscribing any message on them was difficult. The preservation was also difficult and therefore, these cultures were time biased. On the other hand, he has said that the cultures which were based on paper were basically space biased because the paper could be transported over space in a quick fashion. He also says that the time biased media is durable and heavy and therefore is difficult to transport. For example, stone tablets or clay tablets were very difficult to carry. Sometimes they could not also be transported at all. So, they do not support territorial conquest and extension in the way a space biased media which is light and portable based on paper or parchment is. The space biased media can be transported over large distances and therefore, it supports expansion of the empire or a particular type of social efforts over large tracts of space. The time biased media may be long lasting and therefore, it may keep records of an empire existing for a very long time. It can also encourage development of certain civilizations over time and therefore, it is normally favored by the religious and theocratic organizations. In comparison to that, we see that the space biased media has a short lifespan. However, it has a portability which cannot be compared by a time biased media. And because of its easy portability, a space biased media is normally associated with a model which is basically linked with military and empire related expansions. He also says that there are continuous tensions between time biased and space biased media. He also says that the innovation of writing, the way we learn to write, led to the first attempts to record oral cultures. However, normally it is thought that once we have written down or recorded what is included in the oral culture, we normally feel that our work is over. However, it is not true. Writing down a tradition does not mean that mankind is also learning something important from that. So, a past knowledge may be recorded, but mankind may still not be able to learn anything from it. And here it becomes pertinent to quote Gary, who says that whereas the character of storage and reception of the oral tradition favors continuity over time, the written tradition favors discontinuity in time through continuum over space. So, we can say that the culture which is based in writing has an emphasis on present and future, and it moves forward from the traditions, knowledge systems and ceremonies that were embodied within the oral culture which is now only preserved and documented, and therefore, it leaves behind the oral culture and moves on. So, this is a culture of discontinuity which has been suggested by a media which has a bias towards space. Innis also believed that within any system of media, the changes come from the margins or from the periphery. People who are at the periphery ultimately develop their own media, and over a passage of time it comes to inevitably challenge the center. And new media also helps in the consolidation of power. He again takes the example of how the media of the church was challenged by the secular medium which preferred the use of paper. He also says that the oral tradition is malleable and humanistic, whereas the written tradition is inflexible and impersonal. However, there has to be a balance in every culture between the space biased and time biased media if it has to survive for a long duration. And this is exactly his criticism of the Western contemporary media, in which he says that the equilibrium has been lost. He says that there are certain social forms which encourage the evolution of a particular type of new media, and therefore, they also are able to evolve a different worldview. Even though he has often been criticized as being a technology determinist, we can also say that he prefers to analyze and examine the authority which is invested in communication technologies and monopolies of knowledge to mold the different understandings of culture. He has also talked about the shifting monopolies, for example, how the monopoly of oral culture has been replaced by the medium of print, and how the medium of print, for example, the newspapers etc., has been given over to the radio, and then it has been taken over by the television, and then later on by the internet. So, the monopolies keep on changing, but each medium has its own biases which it wants to preserve. However, the juxtaposition of biases with their own set of technologies is also another aspect which Innis has tried to interpret and discuss in detail. Innis has also suggested that monopolies of knowledge and media are continually shifting. He also says that the contemporary monopoly of knowledge, which is based on, in his times, film, print or television etc., is susceptible to emergent forms of media. So, we can say that he is a realist in understanding the impact of technology and media over the way mankind thinks about the worldview. He also suggests that quick transmission of information over long distances has upset the balance which is required for cultural survival. His idea is that in the Western industrial societies, the time is being cut into precise fragments which is suitable to certain specializations like that of engineers or accountants. However, this fragmentation of time into precise modules is not suitable for the continuation of cultural forms or even for the cultural survivals. And therefore, he says that the Western civilization is suffering from what he terms as obsession with present mindedness, in which it has absolutely eliminated concerns about the past or for the future. He has also tried to enumerate in this slide the threats which contemporary Western media had. He says that the communication monopolies which were running the media in his times did not have any challenge from the outside, because unlike the previous media forms, they have learned to speak the language of the masses, and therefore, they have an easier and quicker access to the masses. Whereas other forms of media were limited, the contemporary media which had started emerging in the days of Innis had learned to speak the language of the masses, and therefore, had a maximum possibility to appeal to the emotions of the people and sway their opinion. He says that the American media, because of its efficiency to to use advertisements is particularly effective at mobilizing large audience. He has also referred to the way political propaganda was being circulated using different media innovations in his contemporary days, particularly how the radio and TV was being used. Innis has also criticized the US media in his contemporary days during the days of the Cold War era for being a space centered media, because the occupation of the contemporary media was only with the supremacy of the military power, and therefore it did not bother to maintain its equilibrium with a time centered media approach. This idea of Innis has also influenced various media theorists. Major among them is Marshall Poe, who had proposed a theory on the creation of new media, proposing that new media are pulled into being by organized interests after inventors have developed the technology, or at least the prototypes of a technology which is necessary to support the media. So, in a way, Marshall Poe has tried to envisage the way market forces are responsible for popularizing a particular innovation in technology and generating a particular type of opinion among the masses for it. Innis has influenced the shape of thinking about the interconnections which exist between media and culture and contemporary worldviews. He is also a major influence on the theories of Marshall McLuhan, who was a contemporary, a co-worker for several years, and is primarily known for his dictum, "The medium is the message." McLuhan is also considered to be a pioneer of media studies, and as we have already remarked, he was influenced by new critics. He had trained under F.R. Lewis and I.A. Richards. In 1963, he was appointed to create the Center for Culture Technologies, and is primarily known for his work entitled Understanding Media, which came out in 1964, as well as one of the work which was published prior to it with the title Gutenberg Galaxy. His works have had a major impact on the history and development of media studies. He has tried to examine the history of media technologies and how innovations in media do not only change the culture at a bigger level, but also how do they change the individual cognition and individual capabilities of perceiving things. He has also tried to find out to what extent media can have a psychic effects on individuals, and how it is possible to change the cognition of individual human beings with the help of media technologies. He is primarily known for the phrase "the medium is the message," which he has used in understanding media, suggesting that form is more important than content. He is not happy with the way people were trying to focus on analyzing the content which was being paraded through various media forms in his days, but he suggested that we should also try to understand and study medium or the channel of communication, which also determines or shapes how a content or message is received as well as it is communicated. His idea is that each medium has a particular and inherent effect which shapes its uniqueness as well as which shapes the uniqueness of the message it conveys. He also draws the attention towards the fact how the individual perceptions are changed because of the unique ways of formatting a particular message. The message of any media technology is the change of scale or pace or pattern that it introduces into human affairs. He has taken the example of railway network to illustrate his idea that the medium is also more significant, or at least as significant as the content is. He says that railways in themselves did not bring about any movement in terms of human culture. What they did was to simply accelerate and enlarge the scale of previous human functions, and therefore created new kinds of cities, new kinds of works, and also they were able to create new perceptions of leisure within human activities. So, what McLuhan has said about the railways is also applicable to the media of print, television, computers, and now internet. The medium is the message because it is the medium that shapes and controls the scale and form of human association, action, and interaction with other human beings. In the next module, we would discuss the ideas of Marshall McLuhan in detail. Thank you.